Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully Ralph will tell me if everything is there.
Looks okay. You might need to, yeah, on presentation
Do you
mode.
see red?
Perfect.
Great. Is that all
Excellent.
clear?
Yeah, looks good.
Great. So thank you all. Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Ralph, for the introduction. I'm Layan. I'm a haematology doctor, and like Ralph said, I work for NHS England at the moment, and I work as part of the Health Inequalities team. And one of the tasks at the moment is to build national resources for schools and educators to support students with sickle cell and thalassemia. Obviously, this talk is just for sickle cell, and it's come at the right time. So I'm very thankful to Ralph. And just a quick shout out to Ralph. Thank you for organizing this event. I know how much it must take out of your normal working time to have a very sought after event and bringing us all together and holding the space. So thank you so much for a really important cause. So the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be kind of talking about sickle cell, giving you an introduction about the condition, some important complications to know about the management, and then obviously talk about health inequalities because that's the team I work for. I'm going to kind of work on like building a foundation of knowledge, but then Charlotte and Stacey will take that further and talk about how to kind of implement that information into the classroom and the education setting. So almost building upon the next few points. Yes. So just get this working. Great. So the prevalence of sickle cell disease. So a lot of people don't actually know about sickle cell disease, but and are shocked to find out it's the most common genetically inherited condition in the UK. A long time ago, it was cystic fibrosis, but sickle cell disease, due to its nature in terms of rising prevalence, has now overtaken cystic fibrosis in that ranking. Around 17,000 people are affected in the UK, and I actually think this number is an underestimate. I think it's much higher than that. We haven't had a full registry kind of taking that into consideration, and I don't think that number actually counts people affected in Scotland. And the latest stat is that 300 babies are born each year with the condition. And like I said earlier, the prevalence is rising, so that number is going to be rising as well. So in very simple terms, the inheritance of sickle cell disease can be boiled down to the inheritance in terms of genes. So if you have two affected genes, affected with sickle cell disease, one inherited from each parent, then you have the condition. And this can be kind of further complicated by the different types of genes and the different combinations, and they all fall under this umbrella of sickle cell disease. I don't think it's very important to know about the different combinations, but just to know that there are different combinations that have different physical implications. But when Charlotte and Stacey go on to talk about the effect on learning, I think they'll correct me if I'm wrong, but they're going to be talking about it as a whole. It doesn't really basically matter which combination you have. So if you have two affected genes, one inherited from each parent, you have the condition. And if you only have one affected gene, then you have a sickle cell trait, and you're known as a carrier of the condition. And these generally are completely asymptomatic and only find out because they were tested for it. So two carrier parents have a 50% chance of having carrier children. So 2 in 4 of their children will be carriers. 1 in 4, 25%, will risk of developing the condition, having the condition, and then 1 in 4 risk of not having the condition at all. And if you are a parent with a carrier with someone who's not affected, then you have you don't have the risk of having an affected child at all, and so you have a 50-50 risk, and that changes as well if you have the condition completely. So this is just an interesting slide about the global distribution of sickle cell, and almost to explain why the incidence is rising. So sickle cell, the gene itself, can be found mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, and a bit of the Mediterranean, Asia. And that's mostly to do with where malaria and endemics are found. And that's because the trait status or the carrier status has some protection against malaria. So over time, that gene was survived, and because it survived, communities with that gene survived a long time ago. But as global migration changes and the patterns of migration change, I expect that this image will not stay the same, and actually the heat map will change based on where the gene is going and who's affected by it, and not just by malaria. Fine. So how is it diagnosed? I mentioned earlier that people with the trait status find out when they're tested, and there's 2 points of testing in the UK, which are national screenings. The first one is antenatally, so in a woman in her first trimester of pregnancy will be screened for the condition, and if she's thought to be at risk, then they will do a simple blood test and find out this carrier status. And the second part is in the newborn screening program, which is a heel prick test. So if any of you have children, it's between day 5 and day 8 of a newborn's life that they do the heel prick test, and from a few drops of blood they can tell whether someone has sickle cell disease or is a carrier. And the most common question I get asked at this point is, how can I find out if I am a carrier? Well, especially if someone's planning a family, and they think that that members of their family might have had sickle cell disease or might be carriers, then usually the advice is to arrange a blood test with the GP, or to go to your local kind of sickle cell center, which might offer that service outside of the GP setting. And I think it's mostly important to know if you're a carrier if you're thinking about starting a family, and that might be useful to also know if you have any other hemoglobin problem. But there is no national screening for people considering starting a family. It's only when someone's pregnant that they get screened for it. So just a brief introduction, and now move on to what the condition is and how it's managed. So these are red blood cells. They're found in the blood, millions and millions of them, and their main job is to transport oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the body. The structure of the red blood cells have been perfectly designed to do their job. They are soft, round, they can squeeze into small places to deliver blood to all parts of the body. And in sickle cell disease, what happens is that these red blood cells, under certain conditions, can be transformed into an abnormal shape, into the C shape, which is called a sickle shape. And these are hard, sticky, rigid cells. Unlike the normal red blood cells, they can get caught up, and they don't do their job very well of transporting oxygen. So not only are they troublesome in terms of moving through the capillaries, but they also don't do a very good job of transporting oxygen, which is the role of the red blood cells. Now, the conditions in which these red blood cells might change are called triggers, and these are the most common triggers. So usually an infection, levels of stress, high levels of stress, physical exertion and exhaustion, cold temperatures, and sometimes people even describe as a change of temperature, and dehydration. But not always is a trigger found, and sometimes people who have the red blood cells can sickle without an identified trigger. And I found that this actually image shows it better and how they can get stuck. So the red blood cells sometimes in this tiny capillaries might have to move in like a single file down these capillaries. And if you have the red blood cell sickling, then you can get blockages in those tiny capillaries. So what's the problem with red blood cells that are sickled? And I think we've touched a little bit upon this, but I like to categorize it into 3 main areas, and it helps me kind of understand the condition. The first one is the delivery of oxygen. Like I said, that shape is just not suited to delivering oxygen. Not only is it poor at delivering oxygen, actually your body starts to destroy these sickled red blood cells. And then there's a problem with supply and demand. Your body can't make enough red blood cells to compensate for the ones that are destroyed. And those with the condition then get an anemia. They have a drop in their hemoglobin and they start feeling all the symptoms of anemia, which is a drop in hemoglobin. And that's felt through symptoms like feeling cold, fatigued, tired. They might get, hair loss. They might get palpitations, things like that. The second problem with having sickled red blood cells is that it could block blood vessels. And the problem with that is that anywhere that the blood reaches, it could block a supply to that area. And that can result in severe pain, sudden and severe pain, and also other complications that I'm going to touch upon in the next few slides. The third thing that these sickled red blood cells can do is over time, they can cause damage to different organs in the body. So those with sickle cell disease generally have screening for heart problems, for visual problems in their eyes, kidney problems. Basically, over a long period of time, these sickled red blood cells can damage any organ in the body. And one of the organs to be aware of is the spleen. The spleen has a very important role in destroying infections, especially bacterial infections. So over time, there is damage to the spleen, and people with the condition are thus at high risk of developing infections. And it's really important that they carry out, the normal measures of trying to reduce their infection risk by staying away from others who are sick, hand hygiene, and vaccinations. So I just wanted to go through a few of the complications, and I think this is probably the part that gives most people anxiety. I think the disclaimer I wanted to kind of put here was that I don't expect everybody to know the complications of the condition, but just to understand that there are quite serious complications with this condition, and to know that when a child or an adult in my setting, because I work with adults, is complaining of pain or these symptoms, even if they might not look like they are in pain, that we need to take their complaint very seriously. So I've kind of focused on 4 of the complications to let you know about. Like I said, I don't expect everybody to know all of these, but just to be aware of them and how they might present. So the first one is a painful crisis. This is the most common reason for someone with sickle cell disease to attend the A&E setting. And like I said, it's a blockage in one of the vessels that can cause sudden and severe pain. These crises are usually resolved with really strong painkillers and sometimes might need oxygen or things like that. And they sometimes can be managed at home with pain relief and rest. But when it gets too strong, they usually need to come into hospital for strong painkillers like morphines. The next one is one that probably causes a lot of embarrassment, is priapism, and that's just the medical term for an unwanted, prolonged, painful erection. And it usually can subside with like gentle things like a bath or, some gentle exercise. But again, if that doesn't subside, they would need to come to hospital for some management before it can cause any kind of long-term damage. This, I'm sure, would probably be something that people would talk about if they were suffering from it, but you might see someone like writhing in pain. Yeah. This one, I'm trying to remember what these pictures correspond to. This one was acute chest syndrome. So acute chest syndrome is one of the emergencies in sickle cell disease. It's basically a blockage in the lungs that's usually triggered by infection. They're really unwell. They've got a chest infection, fever, cough, and they look terrible. And they need to come into the emergency department straight away for pain relief, antibiotics, and oxygen. And this can cause, in untreated, can cause death. Here is a picture of a young boy getting screened for mini strokes. So first 2 years of life, there is an ultrasound program where they do an ultrasound to the brain to see if there's any damage to the brain, and then after that they can be checked with MRI scans. So one of the complications here is stroke. Now that's because of a blockage to the blood supply to the brain. A lot of the time people think that it's like a massive stroke where you get these obvious symptoms like the face drooping and the weakness in the arms and legs, and that can happen. But a lot of the time they're actually silent. So you don't see any kind of physical manifestations of the stroke, and they're usually affecting small parts of the brain. And the reason that they're called silent is because you don't have the physical manifestations, but I'm sure Stacey will, and probably Charlotte as well, will talk about how they can have other effects affecting cognitive and learning. And that might be able to be picked up by yourselves if you work closely with these children. And then finally, another emergency, not very common, but emergency nonetheless, is splenic sequestration. So the organ that I've told you previously that was that can get damaged and increase your risk of infection, can also get blocked and can have the pooling of blood in the spleen. And that usually presents as kind of abdomen, tense, painful abdomen, and usually needs to come to hospital as well for that treatment. So didn't want to kind of scare you with all the complications, but mostly to highlight that there are important complications. Some of them are extremely urgent, and to really listen to what a child is saying, or in my case, like I said, an adult, more so than how they're presenting. Oh. Right. I don't know how I'm doing for time. I hope I'm okay. I just wanted to quickly touch upon the management and the health inequalities, just to kind of give you an overview of the condition again. Don't expect that you will remember all of this, but just to know that there are treatment options out there for those with sickle cell disease. There are quite supportive medications there to support the regeneration of blood with vitamins. I mentioned earlier about keeping those with trying to reduce the risk of infection with vaccinations, but also with regular antibiotics. There's also another medication that we use to manage the condition called hydroxyurea. High doses, it's used as a chemotherapy agent, but at low doses, which we use in sickle cell disease, it actually helps promote a different type of hemoglobin being produced that does not sickle. And that medication needs to be monitored quite regularly, and through blood tests and in their appointments. Some children and some adults will be requiring blood transfusions because of the anemia, but also they might be part of a regimen where they replace part of their blood with donated blood, and that that can be given as a one-off in an emergency setting, or as part of a treatment plan every 6 weeks, etc., 6 to 8 weeks. And the one that we replace the blood with requires a lot of blood, something like 6 to 10 units, depending on the adult size, the person's size. And usually at this point, I usually kind of do a little call for donation, because it's really important that blood is matched very well to these patients so that they don't get any risk of, or reducing the risk of any reactions. And so I usually do a little shout out here to say that if you are interested in donating blood, NHS BT, blood and transfusion, is usually where I direct people to go. And you could honestly save a life of someone with sickle cell or any other kind of condition. And finally, there are curative treatments out there for sickle cell. They carry a high risk, but they might be used for patients who have quite severe conditions, and that involves a bone marrow transplant from a kind of sibling donor or gene therapy, which was kind of provided on the NHS sometime this year, which is fantastic news for those with the severe version of their condition. And I do have time to quickly mention something about health inequalities, as I'm part of the health inequalities team of NHS England. A few years ago, back in 2021, the Sickle Cell Society and the APPG for Sickle Cell and Thalassaemia published a report called No One's Listening, which was an inquiry into the avoidable deaths around sickle cell and the failures in care. It's a really harrowing read about people with sickle cell disease who've died from neglect and put down to underlying sentiments of racism and unconscious bias. And recently, in this year, there was another report published by the Race and Health Observatory, which compared sickle cell disease to other inherited conditions, which are less common, but with a similar kind of disease profile. And it was also a very difficult read because it kind of showed the inequalities between those conditions in terms of funding, research and care, and a call for action to try to, address those problems and hopefully try to see change over the next few years. So in summary, sickle cell disease is an important condition with rising prevalence. It has significant impacts and complications on those affected, but also on their family and support. Those with the condition are vulnerable to infections and they are subject to health inequalities. I've just left my details here for anyone who's interested in being part of any kind of work to do with the development of national resources for educators and schools. If you want to be part of the vetting process or before it goes live, please drop me an email and I would be very grateful. And I'll stick around, I think, towards the end for any Q&As. And I hope I haven't taken off too much time.
You're pretty much bang on, Layan. Thank you so much for that.